This happened about 5 years ago, back when I used to do a lot of solo road trips to clear my head. I was 29 at the time, recently divorced, and trying to figure out what to do with my life. Driving had this way of making things quieter up there, you know? That summer, I decided to take a week off and just wander through Colorado, hitting up some small towns and camping spots I'd bookmarked but never actually visited. The plan was simple, no schedules, just miles of open road and a couple of old rock playlists to keep me company. On the third day, I found myself on a back road that didn't even have a name. Just a strip of dirt cutting through a stretch of woods with trees that leaned in a bit too close, like they were trying to listen in. My GPS had lost signal miles back, but I wasn't too worried. I had a full tank and plenty of daylight left, or so I thought. It was around twilight when I first saw them. The sun was bleeding out behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple when my headlights swept across a group of figures. At first, I thought they were deer, moving fast and low along the shoulder, but something was off. The way they moved was all wrong, too fluid, too human. It took a second for my brain to catch up, and when it did, I felt this cold drop of dread slide down my spine. They were running on all fours, arms and legs working in this eerie, synchronized way. There were at least 5 of them, pale and thin, their skin almost glowing in the fading light. My foot came off the gas without me realizing, and as the car slowed, the figures stopped too suddenly and all at once. That's when I saw their heads turn, faces blank and eyes dark, all of them staring straight at me. For a moment, I just sat there, hands clenched around the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. The engine idled, filling the silence with a low rumble that somehow made everything worse. I couldn't make out any details from where I was, but I could feel their eyes fixed on me, unblinking and too dark to reflect the headlights. My mouth was dry, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to hit the gas and get the hell out of there. But I didn't. I don't know if it was shock or just plain stupidity, but my fingers wouldn't move. My foot was frozen on the brake. Then, one of them shifted, a subtle movement like a predator testing the air, and that was enough to snap me out of it. I slammed my foot down, tires spitting gravel as the car lurched forward, the figures vanishing in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop for miles. Trees blurred past, and I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see those pale forms sprinting after me, keeping pace. Eventually, the road smoothed out into asphalt, and I started to think maybe I'd imagined it, that the shadows and exhaustion had gotten to me. But my hands were still shaking, and I couldn't get the image of those eyes out of my head, black and hollow, like they'd been scooped clean. I pulled into a gas station off the highway, the kind with flickering neon signs and one bored attendant behind bulletproof glass. When I stepped out, my legs were jelly, and I just stood there for a minute, breathing in the gasoline and dust, trying to convince myself I wasn't losing it. The clerk must have noticed something off because he asked if I was okay. I started to tell him, stumbled over my words, but the look he gave me, half pity, half suspicion, shut me up real quick. I ended up buying a coffee I didn't want just to have an excuse to stay inside for a bit. The lights were too bright, buzzing faintly, but I welcomed it. Anything was better than the dark road and the memory of those things staring me down. As I stirred sugar into the cup with a hand that wouldn't stop trembling, I overheard two old guys at a corner table talking low. One of them mentioned something about hikers going missing up in the woods nearby, how the rangers chalked it up to bears or folks getting lost, but how anyone local knew better. Said there were places up in those trees where even animals wouldn't go. My stomach twisted, and for a second, I considered asking them more, just blurting out what I'd seen, but the words stuck. I didn't want to sound like a lunatic, especially not to the only people around for miles. So I just left, tossing the coffee untouched into a trash bin on my way out. Getting back in the car felt like stepping into a coffin. The darkness outside the windshield was thicker now, the kind that seems to press in on all sides, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I drove with the high beams on, fingers locked tight on the wheel, eyes flicking to the rear view every few seconds. I kept telling myself I'd find a motel soon, somewhere with lights and people, but the road just stretched on, nothing but pines and shadows. Then, as I rounded a bend, my headlights caught something pale darting between the trees fast, too fast to be anything natural. I nearly swerved off the road, heart hammering so hard it drowned out the radio's static. My palms were slick with sweat, and my breath was coming too quick, too shallow. I sped up, knuckles aching from the grip I had on the wheel, and tried not to think about how many of them might still be out there, watching. About 15 minutes later, I finally spotted a sign for a Motel 1 of those run-down places with peeling paint and a vacancy sign half burnt out. I didn't care. I pulled in so fast the tires squealed, gravel spitting out behind me. The lot was empty except for a rusty pickup, and the office lights cast a sickly yellow glow. I practically fell out of the car, legs still unsteady, and hurried inside. The guy at the desk looked half asleep, a ball game murmuring from a tiny TV behind him. I must have looked like hell because his eyes narrowed when he saw me. I slapped a crumpled bill down, muttering something about needing a room for the night. No questions asked, just a key slid across the counter, room 12 scrawled in faded marker. I took it without a word and hurried back outside, the air sharp and cold enough to burn my lungs. Inside the room, I shoved the chair under the doorknob, more for my nerves than anything, and double-checked the flimsy locks. The walls were thin, wood-paneled, and reeking of old cigarettes, and the bed looked like it hadn't been washed in a decade, but I didn't care. I just needed to be off the road, away from the dark. I sank onto the edge of the mattress, hands still shaking as I rubbed at my eyes, trying to scrub out the image of those pale figures crouched by the roadside. But every time I closed my eyes, there they were, blank faces and dark eyes boring into me. Eventually, I pulled out my phone, more for the comfort of its glow than anything, and stared at the no service icon in the corner until my vision blurred. Sleep was out of the question. I just sat there, listening to the wind scrape branches against the window, each scratch setting my teeth on edge. I don't know when I finally passed out, but it couldn't have been for long. I woke to a sound that sent ice water down my spine, this soft, scraping noise, like nails dragging slow and deliberate along the outside of the door. My heart slammed against my ribs, every nerve screaming to stay quiet, stay still. I held my breath, straining to listen, and there it was again, long and drawn out, like something testing the barrier between us. The room was pitch black except for the red glow of the alarm clock, and I stared at it, barely blinking, watching the minutes crawl by. I kept telling myself it was just a branch, just the wind. But then came a soft rhythmic tap against the window, like fingertips drumming lightly on the glass. I wanted to look, every instinct said not to, but it was like my body wasn't mine anymore. I turned my head, inch by inch, eyes wide and throat tight. Through the thin curtains, I could just make out a pale sliver of something too tall, too thin, limbs bent at angles that made my stomach twist. It stood there motionless, except for one hand tapping against the glass, a slow, deliberate beat. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking at me, knew without a doubt that it had followed me here. The scraping at the door started up again, more insistent this time, like there was more than one of them. My breaths came fast and shallow, blood roaring in my ears. I didn't dare move, didn't even blink, just sat there with my fingers clutching the bedspread so hard the fabric ripped. For what felt like hours, I stayed like that, muscles locked and eyes fixed on the window, waiting for the glass to shatter or the door to burst open. But nothing happened. Eventually, the tapping stopped and the scraping faded into silence, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing in the dark. I didn't sleep after that. Hell, I didn't even move until the first gray light of dawn started to seep through the curtains. My whole body ached from staying so tense, muscles cramped and stiff. But the silence outside was worse, heavy and unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. I waited another 10 minutes, then another, heart pounding in my ears the whole time, before I finally worked up the nerve to peel the curtain back just an inch. The lot was empty. No pale figures, no dark eyes staring back. Just my car dew-covered and alone beneath the weak morning sun. I forced myself to get up, every shadow in the room making me flinch, and threw my stuff into my backpack with shaking hands. The hallway outside was deserted, and I nearly jumped out of my skin when the door creaked shut behind me. All I could think was to get out of there, put as much distance as possible between me and those woods. The guy at the front desk was gone, replaced by an older woman who didn't even look up from her crossword as I tossed the key on the counter and bolted for my car. The engine sputtered to life on the first try, and I pulled out so fast the tires skidded on the gravel. I stuck to the main roads, windows down despite the chill, just to feel less trapped. Eventually, I made it to a diner off the highway, one of those places with red booths and faded menus that all smell like burnt coffee. I found a booth in the back, facing the door, and ordered breakfast just to have an excuse to sit there and breathe. My hands were still shaking when the waitress brought my plate, but at least it was warm and loud and real. I kept telling myself it was over, that I was safe now. But when she came back to refill my coffee, she paused, looking at me with that same pitying suspicion the clerk had. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, and I almost laughed. I forced a chuckle, but it came out brittle and wrong. I didn't bother explaining, what was I supposed to say, that I'd seen a bunch of human-like figures crawling around in the dark? Instead, I just thanked her and stared into my coffee, watching the steam curl and fade. The TV above the counter was playing the local news, mostly dull stuff about weather and a parade in some nearby town. But then a segment came on that made my blood run cold. The anchor mentioned a group of hikers that had gone missing 2 weeks back, somewhere in the same stretch of woods I'd driven through. Search parties had found their campsite abandoned, gear left behind, no tracks leading in or out. The sheriff was calling it an animal attack, but something in the way the anchor's voice faltered said even she didn't buy it. I couldn't help it. My eyes flicked to the window, half expecting to see those dark eyes watching me from the parking lot. But all I saw were trucks and minivans, regular people sipping coffee and reading newspapers. I left a 20 on the table and got out of there, the bell above the door jangling too loud in the quiet. The drive home was a blur, highway signs and mile markers slipping past without me really seeing them. Even in broad daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, of pale figures lurking just beyond the tree line. I kept the radio blasting, anything to drown out the silence, but my thoughts kept drifting back to that stretch of dirt road, to those blank faces and the slow, deliberate tapping on the motel window. I didn't tell anyone about it when I got back. What was the point? No one would believe me, and even if they did, what could they do about it? I told myself to forget, to move on. But even now, 5 years later, I still dream about those eyes cold and dark and waiting. Sometimes I wake up sure I can hear that same faint scratching at my bedroom window, slow and patient, like something out there remembers me too.